Describe your greatest failure. This is a relatively uncommon interview question, but it is absolutely one you might get. And it's very similar to what's your greatest weakness? It's a negative prompt interview question in which the person interviewing you is asking you to recall some situation in which you failed. This seems like a really challenging interview question to navigate, but if you have a good strategy, you'll do just fine. Let's go. Now, what do they want when they ask you this question? Well, they want a few things. They want someone who demonstrates authenticity, right? It is a real story. You are sharing something authentic. Additionally, they want something that straddles the line between that's not actually a great failure and oh my gosh, that is a massive, huge, giant red flag mistake. They want something in the middle. And lastly, they want you to demonstrate that you've actually learned something after having failed. Now, although this interview question is not a behavioral interview question in which they say something like, tell me about a time when, and they launch into the question, I would treat it like that. So I would use the STAR method. That's situation, task, action, result. Use that as a framework to go through and answer this interview question so you can give them a full picture of exactly what it was when you failed, what was the situation, what was the task you were responsible for, what was your action, and then what was the outcome. Follow it up by the L in terms of what did you learn, and that's a great general framework for answering this interview question. Now, I have a few general tips that will also help you succeed when you're answering this. The first one, I call this the 50% rule. Whenever you're asked a question in which they're asking you to demonstrate something where you made a mistake, you messed up, use the first 50% of your career. Find an example. So if you've been working for 10 years, find something in the first 5 years. That way you've also put some distance between when it happened and current state. If your greatest mistake was something that happened 3 weeks ago, that's a little bit concerning, right? Because maybe at this point in your career, you shouldn't be making such significant mistakes. Now, everybody makes mistakes, but if you're talking about the greatest single mistake of your career, for me, a good rule of thumb is make sure it's in the first 50% of your career. Now, another big thing that you need to avoid when you're answering this interview question is you don't want to be overly negative. It is really easy to be super negative talking about the situation. Odds are your single greatest career mistake, it wasn't just you. You weren't on an island. You were probably participating with a group of people. And it's really easy to be negative and then start talking about people you've worked with in the past negatively. You want to avoid that. Any chance to insert some negativity into a question, that's going to be a bad thing for you. It isn't going to serve you. So when you're going through and you're sharing the story, make sure you're not being overly negative, especially when it's about former bosses, former teammates, former organizations. You want to be talking about this removed from the emotion. Talk about the mistake, talk about what happened, talk about what you learned, but don't be overly negative as you're describing it. And when you're answering this question, a big key here is that a large portion of your answer, maybe a third of it, the last third, should be about what you've learned, how you're better because of this, how you've taken that experience and you've turned it into a positive. Now, whenever you encounter similar situations, you have really good strategy. You know what to avoid, and in general, you are a better professional because you've experienced this. It's really important that they walk away with that feeling knowing, wow, that was a tough situation. You know, it didn't go as planned, it wasn't ideal, but Ben learned a lot from there, and since then, he's implemented many things that have made him a stronger business professional. Okay, so what are some good examples? Now, a few ones you might want to reference are anytime maybe you turned in a project late because you didn't prioritize something. This is something that many people can relate to. We've all been there where there was a lot of competing deadlines and maybe we didn't appropriately prioritize things, and because of that, something turned in late. This is significant enough to warrant answering this question, but it's not unforgivable. Now, another thing that you could reference is maybe you had a presentation to give and you kind of waited on it and you rushed it. And then when you gave that presentation, it wasn't your best quality work. Maybe there were spelling errors, maybe you were missing some slides, something like that. That, again, isn't completely concerning, especially if it was in the first half of your career. And maybe you can follow it up by talking about now when you give presentations, you make sure that you show it to another person before you ever show it to your intended audience. How you go through it out loud and you actually practice it to make sure none of these spelling errors or you're not missing something when it comes to the actual presentation. That's another good example. Lastly, you could take this as an opportunity to share something semi-personal. Maybe it's something when you're going and getting your degree at university, or maybe it was when you were getting your master's degree. Maybe there was some place where you let yourself down and you didn't live up to your own expectation. And that could be something that was your greatest failure. But again, remember, anytime you're doing this, the conclusion should be, and because of this, I now do blank. I am a better professional for it. I have learned. I don't look back on this negatively. It's something negative that happened, but it's a net positive because I have learned so much. Now, when you answer the interview question like that, you are going to nail it, so you should watch this video. This video here is a guide on how to maximize your salary. In this video, I go over everything you're ever going to need to know as someone who is interviewing to get the best salary possible. From positioning early on to talking about salary and finally countering their offer. So watch that now.